Claire Whitfield was halfway through a routine check of the overnight signal logs when her headset went dead in her ear. Not muffled, not crackling. Dead, as if someone had reached out and cut a wire inside her skull. She pulled the headset off and stared at it, tapping the side out of habit, the way people tap a phone that has frozen. Nothing happened. The little indicator light that always glowed green had gone completely dark. She looked up at the wall of monitors above her desk. Every single one. 40 screens that tracked global radio chatter, satellite pings, and encrypted military traffic, had turned to a flat, lifeless gray. No error message. No static. Just gray, like a blank page waiting for something to be written on it. "Hey," she called across the room, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. "Is anyone else getting this?" A young technician named Nathan Price wheeled his chair back from his own station, frowning at his own dead screen. "My feed just cut out too. Thought it was my machine." Within a minute, the entire room was on its feet. Analysts who had spent years training themselves to stay calm under pressure were suddenly talking over one another, checking cables, restarting systems, calling out to supervisors who had no better answers than they did. The building had 3 separate power sources and 4 separate communication systems, built specifically so that nothing could take them all down at once. All 4 were silent. Claire grabbed her landline, an old backup phone that had not been used in years, kept only because regulations required it. She lifted the receiver and heard nothing. Not a dial tone. Not even the faint hiss of an open line. Absolute silence. The kind that made her stomach drop. Because silence like that was not supposed to be possible. Outside the building, the city was beginning to notice too. Traffic lights blinked out block by block. Not from a power failure, since streetlights and shop windows stayed lit, but because the systems that controlled them had lost whatever signal told them what to do next. Phones across the city buzzed once, then fell still in pockets and on tables. Screens frozen on whatever they had last displayed. A woman walking her dog stopped to stare at her phone, shook it, and kept walking, assuming it was just her. It was not just her. It was not just the city. It was not just the country. At an airport 40 miles away, an air traffic controller named Grace Sutton watched with growing horror as every plane on her radar display seemed to hover in place, their transponder signals frozen mid-flight. She snatched up her radio and pressed the call button. "Flight 722, do you copy?" Nothing came back, not even the hollow rush of an open channel. She tried 3 more aircraft, her voice rising with each attempt, until a colleague gently took the radio from her hand and pointed at his own screen, which showed the exact same frozen silence. Pilots in the air noticed it almost immediately. Cockpit instruments that relied on external signals began drifting out of sync, though the mechanical instruments, the ones built with old technology and no dependence on satellites, kept working fine. Experienced pilots switched to those manual systems out of instinct, some of them not even sure why, only that their training told them something was deeply wrong, and the old ways were the only ones they could trust. Across the ocean, in a research station built into the side of a quiet mountain, a physicist named Daniel Hurst had been awake for nearly 2 days straight, running instruments that measured the upper atmosphere. He had noticed something odd hours earlier, long before the world went silent, though at the time he had assumed it was equipment error. A faint pulse, almost nothing, a ripple of energy passing through the ionosphere, moving in a pattern too clean, too deliberate, to be natural. He had flagged it, sent a message to a colleague, and gone back to work, telling himself it was probably just a glitch in the sensor array. Now, staring at his own dead monitors, he pulled up the last readings his instruments had captured before everything went quiet. The pulse he had seen earlier had not been a glitch. It had grown, spreading outward in slow, widening rings, like something enormous breathing out across the sky. And then, at the exact moment the pulse reached its peak, every signal on Earth had gone still. Daniel sat back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the strange thrill of understanding something before anyone else did. He grabbed a pen and a paper notebook, an old habit his professors had drilled into him years ago, and began sketching the pattern of the pulse from memory while it was still fresh in his mind. He needed to reach someone, anyone, but there was no way to send a message, no way to call, no way to warn a single person about what he had seen. He was as cut off as everyone else, holding a piece of the puzzle that nobody else could see. Meanwhile, government buildings across the world were falling into a strange, uneasy chaos. Officials who relied entirely on digital systems to run their countries suddenly found themselves reduced to messengers on foot and handwritten notes carried between offices. In one capital city, a young aide sprinted 3 blocks through evening traffic just to deliver a single sheet of paper to a senior official, because there was no other way to get the message there in time. General Henry Dalton stood in the middle of a command room that had gone almost completely dark, save for a handful of emergency lights along the walls. Around him, officers spoke in clipped, urgent voices, trying to reach anyone, anywhere, using systems that had worked flawlessly for decades and now refused to work at all. "Sir," one of the younger officers said, his voice unsteady, "we've lost contact with every unit outside this building. Ships at sea, aircraft in the air, our own command posts 2 floors down. Nothing is getting through." Dalton kept his face still, the way he had trained himself to do for 30 years, but inside, a cold and unfamiliar feeling was spreading through his chest. He had planned for many kinds of crisis. He had run drills for cyber attacks, for natural disasters, for outright acts of aggression. None of those drills had ever accounted for a silence this total, this instant, and this impossible to explain. "Get me anything," he said quietly. "A radio that still works, a landline, a messenger on a bicycle if that's what it takes. I want eyes and ears back, even if they're the oldest ones we have." Officers scattered to obey, and Dalton turned to look at the bank of dead screens along the far wall, screens that should have been showing him satellite feeds, troop positions, and weather patterns from every corner of the globe. Instead, they showed nothing at all, and in that nothing, he sensed something watching. Back at the research station, Daniel Hurst had finally managed to get an old shortwave radio working, one so outdated that it needed no digital signal at all, only a simple analog wave passing through open air. He turned the dial slowly, searching for any voice, any sound, anything to prove the whole world had not gone silent at once. Static hissed through the small speaker, and then, faintly, a voice broke through, tired and afraid, speaking from somewhere on the other side of the country. Daniel leaned closer, his heart pounding, and listened as the voice repeated the same simple question over and over, a question that Daniel himself did not yet have an answer for. "Can anyone hear me? Is anyone still out there?" Daniel picked up the small microphone attached to the radio, his hands steady despite the tightness in his chest, and pressed the button to speak. Whatever had caused the silence, whatever had reached out and touched the entire planet at once, he was no longer willing to sit quietly and wonder. Somewhere above the clouds, something had changed the rules of the world in an instant, and he intended to find out exactly what it was, and why it had chosen this moment, and this world, to do it. In a hospital near the coast, a nurse named Olivia Marsh stood frozen in a hallway, staring at a heart monitor that had gone strangely quiet, its screen locked on the last reading it had taken before the silence hit. For one terrifying second, she thought the machine had failed the patient it was watching over. Then she noticed every other monitor on the floor showed the exact same frozen number, the exact same locked screen, and she understood that this was not a single machine failing. It was something far larger, something that had reached into every wired and wireless system in the building at once. She moved quickly from room to room, checking on patients by hand, taking pulses the old way, with her fingers pressed gently against a wrist, counting seconds on a watch that, thankfully, still ticked along as it always had. The mechanical clock on the wall kept perfect time, indifferent to whatever had silenced everything else. It was a strange comfort, watching that small second hand sweep steadily around its face, while the rest of the world seemed to be holding its breath. Down the hall, a young father paced outside a delivery room, his phone useless in his pocket, unable to call his own mother to tell her she was about to become a grandmother. He caught Olivia's eye as she passed and asked, in a voice trying hard to sound calm, whether the hospital's equipment for his wife and the coming baby would still work without the outside signals. Olivia told him the truth, because she believed people deserved the truth, even in frightening moments. The equipment that mattered most, the machines that kept people alive, ran on systems built to work even in a total blackout. Whatever had happened to the rest of the world, this hospital had not lost its ability to care for the people inside it. He nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, and Olivia continued down the hallway, aware that behind every closed door in the city, similar quiet moments of fear and reassurance were playing out again and again. A silence this complete did not simply stop machines. It reached into ordinary lives, into ordinary rooms, and reminded people how much of their sense of safety depended on invisible signals they never had to think about until the signals disappeared. Outside, in the parking lot, a delivery driver named Ethan Cole sat in his van with the engine running, staring at a phone that refused to load a single map, a single message, a single working application. He had a full night of deliveries ahead of him, and no way to know which addresses still needed him. He decided, after a moment of thought, to simply keep driving the route he already knew by memory, trusting his own sense of the city more than he had ever trusted it before. It felt strange to rely so completely on himself, but there was something steadying about it too, a reminder that people had found their way around, long before signals and screens existed at all. By the time night fully settled over the city, a strange calm had begun to spread alongside the fear, the calm of people adapting quickly to a world that had, without warning, become a little more like the one their grandparents had known. Yet beneath that calm, in command rooms and research stations and quiet government offices, a far more serious question was taking shape. If this silence had not happened by accident, then someone, or something, had caused it on purpose, and nobody yet understood why. Far above the surface of the Earth, higher than any aircraft could fly, something enormous had settled into a slow, silent orbit, its presence hidden from every telescope and satellite that might once have detected it. It had not come to destroy. It had not come to conquer. It had come only to listen, carefully, patiently, the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat before making a diagnosis. But it had no way of knowing that the silence it created, meant only as a careful first step, had already begun to look, to the frightened people below, like the opening move of an attack. The first person to see them was a fisherman named Nathaniel Gray, far out on the open water long before sunrise, checking his nets in the dark. He noticed the stars above him seemed to be disappearing in a strange moving pattern, as if something enormous were sliding silently across the sky, blotting out one cluster of light after another. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and told himself it was exhaustion. Then the shape passed low enough that he felt a faint pressure in his ears, and he understood that whatever this was, it was not exhaustion, and it was not his imagination. By dawn, similar reports were pouring in from coastlines and cities around the world, though pouring in was the wrong phrase for a planet with no working communication. Instead, the reports spread the old way, person to person, shouted across streets, passed along by neighbors leaning out of windows. Enormous shapes had appeared in the sky overnight, holding perfectly still in low orbit, visible even without a telescope, dark and smooth and utterly silent. Claire Whitfield stood on the roof of her building with a small crowd of co-workers, staring up at one of the shapes hanging directly above the city. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It simply sat there, catching the first light of morning, along one curved edge, looking less like a machine and more like something that had always belonged in the sky and had only now chosen to be seen. "That's not one of ours," Nathan Price said quietly beside her, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might draw its attention. "No," Claire agreed. "It's not." She thought about the dead radio logs, the frozen phones, the silence that had swallowed the entire world less than a day earlier. It could not be a coincidence. Whatever these shapes were, they had arrived at the exact moment every human system of communication had gone dark, as if the silence had been prepared specifically to make room for their arrival. In the command room beneath the city, General Henry Dalton received the news the same way everyone else had, through a shouted message relayed from a rooftop observer down 3 flights of stairs to a runner who sprinted the final distance on foot. He listened to the breathless report, then walked to the small window near the ceiling of the underground room and looked up through the reinforced glass at a sliver of visible sky. He could see it from there too, a dark shape, motionless, patient. "How many?" he asked, not turning around. "Reports vary, sir. Somewhere between a dozen and several dozen, spread out over different regions. They all appeared at roughly the same time." Dalton felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest, that came before every difficult decision he had ever made in his career. 30 years of training told him that an unknown, overwhelming force appearing without warning, having first stripped away every means of communication and coordination, was not a peaceful gesture. It was a textbook opening move, the kind taught in military academies as the ideal way to disable an enemy before striking. Cut off the ability to communicate, then reveal overwhelming strength, then wait to see how the isolated, blinded target responds. He did not know, and had no way of knowing, that the truth was almost the exact opposite of what he feared. The beings who had caused the silence had done so not to disable a threat, but to study a civilization in its rawest and most honest state, free from the noise and performance of a species that always knew when it was being watched. They believed, based on careful study of countless other worlds, that this was the only way to truly understand who a people were underneath their public faces. They had removed the noise so they could hear something true. But intentions, no matter how carefully considered, mean nothing if they cannot be communicated. And these visitors, confident in a plan that had worked calmly and successfully many times before, on many other worlds, had not accounted for a species whose very first instinct, when frightened and confused, was to reach for its weapons. Word of the silent shapes reached every corner of the world within hours, spreading through shouted messages, hand-delivered notes, and old radios crackling with rumor and fear. Governments that had spent the previous day scrambling simply to restore basic order now faced a far larger crisis, one none of their emergency plans had ever imagined. Leaders who could not speak to each other, could not confirm facts, could not coordinate any kind of unified response, were forced to make enormous decisions almost entirely alone. In the underground command room, Dalton called together every senior officer he could reach in person, since no call could reach the ones who were elsewhere. Around a long table lit by battery-powered lamps, they debated the same question that governments everywhere were asking in isolation from one another, unaware that the same conversation was happening simultaneously across the globe. If this is the beginning of an attack, one officer argued, leaning forward with both hands flat on the table, then every hour we spend deliberating is an hour we lose in preparation. We should assume the worst and act accordingly. And if it isn't an attack, Grace Sutton countered, having been brought in from the airport to advise on aerial activity, then arming ourselves for war might be exactly the wrong signal to send, assuming they can even read our signals the way we read theirs. Dalton listened to both arguments, feeling the weight of a decision that would once have been shared among dozens of allied nations, coordinated through years of careful diplomacy and instant communication. Now he had neither the luxury of consultation nor the comfort of shared responsibility. He alone, in this fractured, silent version of the world, would have to decide how his country responded to whatever was hanging silently in the sky above it. "We prepare," he said finally, his voice quiet but final. Quietly. "No visible mobilization that might be read as provocation, but I want every available unit ready to move on short notice. We do not fire first under any circumstances. We do not act aggressively, but we will not be caught unprepared if this is what it looks like." It was, in his mind, a careful, measured decision, the kind of restrained caution that seemed entirely reasonable given the circumstances. He had no way of knowing that dozens of other commanders, in dozens of other countries, were reaching the exact same careful, measured decision at the exact same time, each one convinced they alone were exercising restraint while quietly preparing for the worst. High above the surface of the world, aboard the vessel that hung in silent orbit over Dalton's city, a being whose name existed only as a pattern of light and sound too complex for human language, observed the same quiet mobilization Dalton believed was invisible. The vessel's instruments, built to read the subtlest movements of energy and matter across an entire planet, saw everything. They saw the missile silos being quietly armed. They saw naval vessels adjusting their positions. They saw aircraft being fueled and readied on runways around the world, all under cover of careful secrecy that meant nothing to instruments capable of tracking a single heartbeat from orbit. The being observed this with a growing sense of concern that had nothing to do with fear for its own safety. Its vessel, and the many others positioned quietly around the planet, were equipped with defenses far beyond anything the young species below could imagine. There was no danger to the observers themselves. The concern was different, deeper, and far more troubling. Every previous world they had studied using this same careful method, stripping away noise to observe a civilization's honest behavior, had responded to the silence with confusion, then curiosity, then eventually a cautious, hopeful attempt at communication. This world was responding differently. This world, faced with silence and an unexplained presence in its sky, had chosen, almost universally and almost immediately, to prepare for violence. The being relayed this observation to the others, coordinating the study, and a quiet, uneasy discussion began aboard vessels scattered across the planet's orbit, conducted in patterns of light too fast and too complex for any human instrument to detect, even if human instruments had still been working. Some among them argued this reaction, though alarming, was simply the fear of a young and isolated species, and should be understood with patience rather than judgment. Others argued that a species whose deepest instinct, even in confusion, was to reach for weapons, might not yet be ready for the kind of contact they had originally hoped to offer. Neither side could agree, and so the observation continued, patient and careful, while below them, entirely unaware of the deliberation happening above their heads, human nations continued quietly readying themselves for a war that none of them wanted, and none of them had asked for, and none of them yet understood was being watched, and misunderstood, in return. Not every commander showed the same restraint as Dalton. In another part of the world, a younger officer named Marcus Ellery, commanding a squadron of fighter aircraft from a coastal airbase, made a decision that would ripple outward, far beyond his own small command. Convinced that waiting passively while an unidentified craft hovered over his base was a mistake, he ordered 2 aircraft into the air for a closer look, reasoning that a brief, careful pass would provide information without provoking anything. The 2 jets climbed steadily, engines roaring in a sky that had otherwise fallen unnervingly quiet, and approached the nearest of the silent shapes at a respectful distance. The pilots, trained for years to remain calm under pressure, felt their hands tighten on the controls as the true scale of the vessel became clear. From the ground, it had looked large. From the air, close enough to make out details along its smooth, curved hull, it looked impossibly vast, large enough to make the fighter jets beside it seem like insects circling a mountain. The vessel did not react with any visible aggression. It made no attempt to strike the approaching aircraft, fired nothing, moved not at all. But as the jets circled closer, a faint pulse of light rippled briefly across its surface, there and gone, in less than a second. A gesture that meant nothing threatening in the language of its creators, but looked, to 2 frightened pilots watching from the cockpit of aircraft designed for battle, exactly like a weapon powering up. Both pilots broke off immediately, peeling away in opposite directions, and returned to base at full speed, reporting to Ellery that the craft had, in their words, prepared to fire on them. Ellery relayed the report up his own chain of command through a hand-carried message, and within hours, a version of that report, growing more alarming with every retelling, had reached command centers far beyond his own base, feeding directly into the same fears that Dalton and officers like him around the world were already struggling to contain. The being watching from aboard that vessel had no understanding of how its brief, curious pulse of light, meant only to observe the aircraft's structure in greater detail, had been read as a threat. It logged the encounter simply as a moment of close observation, unaware that on the ground below, that same moment was already being described, in increasingly urgent terms, as an act of open hostility. Meanwhile, in a modest government building far from any command center, a young diplomat named Isabel Farrow sat across a table from 2 colleagues from neighboring countries, all 3 having traveled for most of a day, using nothing but old maps and a borrowed car to reach a location they had once used for quiet, informal talks, long before the current crisis began. With no way to reach their own governments quickly, the 3 of them had decided, independently and almost desperately, that some form of coordination between neighboring nations was better than none at all. If even a handful of countries move toward conflict, Isabel said quietly, spreading a paper map across the table between them, the rest may feel forced to follow, simply out of fear of being left undefended. We need some way to slow that down, even informally, even without any real authority to enforce it. Her 2 colleagues agreed. though none of them had any illusions about how much difference a quiet meeting between three tired diplomats might actually make, against the momentum already building in capitals around the world. Still, they spent the rest of the afternoon drafting a simple, handwritten statement, a shared call for restraint, intending to have it copied and carried by hand to as many nearby offices as they could reach before nightfall. It was a small, almost powerless gesture in the face of something so enormous. But it was, they agreed, better than doing nothing while the world drifted quietly toward a mistake none of them could see clearly enough to stop. Daniel Hurst, still working from his mountain research station with nothing but an old shortwave radio and a growing collection of handwritten notes, had begun piecing together a theory that felt almost too strange to say aloud. He believed the shapes in the sky and the silence that preceded them were connected, not as separate acts of aggression, but as parts of a single, deliberate action, and if that were true, then the silence itself might be a kind of message, one that no one on Earth yet knew how to read. He picked up his radio microphone once more, hoping the voice from the night before might still be listening somewhere across the static, and began to speak, slowly and clearly, laying out everything he had observed. He had no way of knowing whether anyone with the power to act on his theory would ever hear it. But he spoke anyway, because the alternative, staying silent while the world edged closer to a mistake it might never recover from, was no longer a choice he was willing to make. 3 days into the silence, the world had settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt, to those living through it, almost more frightening than the initial shock. Cities had adapted quickly, with messengers on bicycles replacing phone calls, community boards replacing news broadcasts, and old radios pulled from attics and closets becoming treasured, precious objects. But beneath that surface of adaptation, a much darker kind of readiness had taken hold in the quiet corridors of power, one that most ordinary people never saw and never suspected. General Henry Dalton had not slept properly in 3 days. He moved through the underground command room with the careful, deliberate steps of a man running on discipline rather than rest, checking reports that arrived slower and slower, as the messengers delivering them grew more exhausted themselves. The picture those reports painted was becoming clearer with every hour, and it was not a picture that offered him any comfort. Confirmed movement from at least 11 other countries, an officer reported, laying a hand-drawn map across the table, its borders marked with small symbols representing troop positions, gathered from scattered, unreliable sources. Naval deployments, aircraft on alert status, and at least 3 nations reporting their most sensitive weapons systems have been placed on heightened readiness. Dalton studied the map in silence for a long moment. He had ordered his own country into a similar state of quiet readiness days earlier, believing it to be a careful, restrained response to an unprecedented threat. Now, seeing the same pattern repeated across nearly a dozen other nations, each acting in isolation, each convinced they alone were being cautious, he understood, with a cold clarity, exactly what was happening. No single country was choosing war, but every country, acting alone and unable to confirm anyone else's intentions, was making the same fearful calculation, and the sum of all those careful individual decisions was beginning to look, from any outside vantage point, exactly like a planet arming itself for battle. He thought, briefly, of the strange pulse of light Ellery's pilots had reported days earlier, the one interpreted as a weapon preparing to fire. He had turned that report over in his mind many times since, and a small, persistent doubt had begun to grow alongside his caution. What if that pulse had meant something else entirely? What if the movement he had just heard reported, gathering across nearly a dozen nations, was every country making the exact same mistake in return? He did not have the luxury of certainty, and uncertainty, in his line of work, had always meant preparing for the worst possible outcome. So even as the small doubt lingered, he gave the order to move his country's readiness one careful step further, joining, without knowing it, the same fearful spiral that governments around the world were tightening around themselves. High above, aboard the vessels still holding their silent orbit, the beings observing this spiral watched with growing alarm of their own. What had begun as isolated, scattered movements of weapons and personnel had, over 3 days, become something far more coordinated in appearance, even though no coordination between nations had actually occurred. Their instruments, capable of tracking every meaningful movement of matter and energy across the surface of the planet, painted a picture that looked, to eyes unfamiliar with the chaos of divided, uncoordinated fear, exactly like a unified, deliberate military buildup. "They are preparing," one of the observers reported to the gathered council, coordinating the study. Its message conveyed in shifting patterns of light, too intricate for any human science to interpret. Every major population center shows the same pattern. Weapons moved to readiness. Defensive positions established. This is not the behavior of a species responding with confusion or fear alone. This is deliberate preparation. Another voice within the council, one that had argued from the beginning for patience and a slower, gentler approach to this particular world, pushed back against that conclusion. Or it is exactly what confusion and fear look like, multiplied across a species too fragmented to speak with itself, let alone with us. We removed their ability to communicate not only with us, but with each other. Is it truly a surprise that isolated groups, unable to confirm what their neighbors intend, each choose the safest path for themselves alone, even if that path looks, from above, like something far more threatening than it is? The council could not agree, and so the observation continued, extended now by several more days, as both sides of the debate hoped for some clearer sign that would settle the argument one way or another. Neither side yet understood how close that extended patience was coming to running out entirely, on both sides of the growing divide. In the coastal city where Olivia Marsh worked, the strain of 3 days without reliable news had begun to show in ways that worried her more than any single machine failure ever could. Crowds gathered outside grocery stores each morning, long before opening, driven by rumors passed hand to hand that supplies might run short if the silence continued much longer. Most days ended peacefully enough, but the tension in those gathered crowds grew a little sharper with each passing sunrise, fed by fear of the unknown shapes overhead and frustration with a world that no longer explained itself the way it once had. Olivia found herself, during a rare break between hospital shifts, standing at the edge of one such crowd, listening to a man loudly insisting that the shapes in the sky had already begun preparing an attack, based on nothing more than a story he had heard from a cousin of a friend who claimed to have seen strange lights near a military base. Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, their fear looking for any explanation solid enough to hold on to, even a false one. A quieter voice near the back of the group offered a different view, an older woman who pointed out that in 3 full days, despite every fear and every rumor, not a single person had actually been harmed by anything falling from the sky. Whatever these visitors intended, she argued, they had, so far, done nothing but watch. The crowd's mood shifted slightly at that, not toward calm exactly, but toward a more thoughtful, uncertain kind of waiting, and Olivia found herself grateful for that one steady voice among so many frightened ones. She thought, walking back to the hospital afterward, about how much of what was happening across the world right now was probably unfolding in exactly this way, in 1,000 small crowds and quiet conversations, each one shaping, in some small measure, whether people leaned toward fear or toward patience. It felt strange to realize that the outcome of something as enormous as first contact with another world might depend, in part, on conversations this small and this ordinary, repeated over and over in doorways and street corners everywhere. Back on the surface, Claire Whitfield had been reassigned, along with much of her original team, to a newly formed group, tasked with a single, nearly impossible goal: find any way, using any available technology, to re-establish contact between scattered command centers, and if possible, with the silent shapes hanging in the sky above every major city on the planet. It was a task that felt, most days, entirely hopeless, but Claire had never been the kind of person who gave up simply because a problem seemed too large. She worked alongside Nathan Price and a small rotating group of engineers, testing every old, low-technology method they could think of: semaphore flags, signal mirrors, mechanical telegraph systems pulled from museum storage. Most attempts produced nothing but frustration, since even if they managed to send a message across short distances, there was no way to know whether anything above the clouds was even capable of receiving it, let alone willing to respond. "We're guessing," Nathan admitted one evening, rubbing his eyes after another failed attempt with a modified signal light aimed toward the nearest hovering shape. "We have no idea what they can even perceive. For all we know, they can't see light the way we do. They might sense the world in ways we can't even imagine. Claire didn't disagree, but she also refused to accept that guessing was the same as giving up. Then we keep trying every guess we can think of, until one of them works, or until we run out of ideas entirely. I'd rather fail trying than fail from doing nothing. Their persistence, though it did not yet know it, was slowly converging toward the same idea Daniel Hurst had already begun exploring from his mountain research station, hundreds of miles away. Neither team knew of the other's work, cut off as they were from any way of sharing information across such a distance. But both, independently, were beginning to suspect that the answer to reaching the silent shapes above them lay not in more advanced technology, but in something far older, simpler, and more universal than any digital signal ever could be. Daniel had spent the past 2 days experimenting with the small shortwave radio that had first connected him to a stranger's voice in the dark. Working with the voice's guidance, a retired engineer named Walter Combe, who had spent decades restoring old broadcasting equipment as a hobby, Daniel had begun modifying the radio's output, stripping away every modern digital component and reducing the signal to its simplest possible form. A pattern of pulses not unlike the earliest radio transmissions ever sent by human beings, more than a century before any of the technology that had just gone silent had even been imagined. If the silence targeted modern digital signals specifically, Daniel explained to Walter over the crackling radio connection, sketching diagrams in his notebook as he spoke, then maybe it didn't touch signals simple enough to predate all of that. It's a guess, but it's the best one I've got. Walter, who had spent most of his life quietly convinced that the oldest technologies were often underestimated by younger engineers chasing whatever was newest, agreed readily. Together, working across a connection that felt more fragile with every passing hour, they began drafting a message, one built not from words in any single language, but from mathematics, the closest thing to a universal language either of them could imagine, simple sequences of numbers representing prime values, geometric patterns, and the basic physical constants that governed the universe itself, values that any sufficiently advanced civilization, wherever it came from, would likely recognize. It was slow, painstaking work, made harder by the limitations of the equipment and the exhaustion pulling at both men after days without proper rest. But for the first time since the silence began, Daniel felt something close to hope, a fragile, cautious sense that he might be building the first real bridge between two worlds that had, through no fault of their own, badly misunderstood each other from the very first moment of contact. That fragile hope nearly ended entirely on the fourth night, when the spiral of fear that had been quietly tightening around the world finally produced its first true crisis. In a heavily fortified command bunker on the other side of the world, a senior military official, exhausted, frightened, and convinced by days of mounting reports that an attack was not only likely but imminent, gave a preliminary order to prepare a long-range missile system for launch, intending it as a final, desperate deterrent rather than an actual attack. The order was meant to remain purely preparatory, a last resort that would never actually be used, but orders given under exhaustion and fear do not always stay contained the way they are intended to. A junior officer receiving the order, new to his position and terrified of making a mistake that might cost lives, misunderstood a critical detail in the hurried, handwritten instructions passed down to him through 3 separate messengers, each simplifying the message slightly as it traveled. What had been intended as preparation only became, in his understanding, an active countdown, and he began the sequence exactly as he believed he had been ordered to. High above, the vessel positioned nearest that particular launch site detected the sudden, unmistakable spike of energy building within the weapon system below, a signature its instruments recognized immediately as the ignition sequence of a powerful, long-range weapon. For the observers aboard that vessel, the long and uneasy debate about patience and understanding suddenly collapsed into something far more urgent. Whatever this world's true intentions had been throughout the strange, tense days of observation, this was no longer a question of interpretation. This was an active, imminent act of aggression, and it required an immediate response. The vessel began, within seconds, its own defensive preparations, systems built to disable a threat of this kind, long before it could ever leave the ground. systems that had never once needed to be used in all the centuries. This particular method of careful, quiet observation had been practiced across countless other worlds. On the ground, in the command bunker where the mistaken order had originated, a senior communications officer noticed the error in the junior officer's countdown at almost the exact same moment, catching a discrepancy between the handwritten order and what was actually being executed. She shouted across the room, sprinting the short distance between consoles, and physically stopped the sequence with seconds to spare, overriding the young officer's actions before the weapon system could complete its final stage. The countdown halted. The immediate crisis, on the ground, was over almost as quickly as it had begun, a near miss that only a handful of exhausted, frightened people in that single bunker would ever fully understand had happened at all. But above, aboard the vessel that had detected the weapon's ignition sequence, the defensive systems already in motion could not be halted quite as easily. A single, precise pulse of energy, calibrated only to disable the weapon system rather than cause any wider harm, had already been released, traveling faster than any human instrument could have detected it coming. It struck the weapon system exactly as intended, rendering it permanently inoperable in complete silence, without any explosion, without any visible damage beyond a faint shimmer of heat rising briefly from the site. No one on the ground was harmed. No one, in fact, immediately understood what had happened at all, since the weapon's failure looked, at first glance, like nothing more than a sudden and unexplained malfunction. But high above, the Council of Observers understood exactly what had just occurred, and the careful, patient balance of their long debate shifted, in a single instant, decisively toward those who had argued from the beginning that this young, frightened, and fractured species might not yet be ready for the kind of contact they had originally hoped to offer. Word of the strange, unexplained weapon failure spread quickly through military channels, carried by messengers who described it in hushed, uncertain tones, unsure themselves what they had witnessed. Some officers assumed it was simple mechanical failure, a stroke of luck in the middle of a terrifying mistake. Others, including the communications officer who had stopped the countdown with only seconds remaining, suspected something else entirely, though she kept that suspicion mostly to herself, unwilling to sound as though she believed the shapes overhead had reached down and touched their world directly. General Dalton, hearing the report relayed to him hours later through his own exhausted network of messengers, felt that same small, persistent doubt from days earlier grow sharper and more insistent. A weapon system, one of the most reliable and carefully maintained in the entire arsenal, failing in complete silence at the exact moment it was being prepared for launch, felt far too convenient and far too precise to be a simple accident. He said nothing of this suspicion to the officers around him, unwilling to add another layer of uncertainty to an already fragile situation, but he began, quietly and without telling anyone, to reconsider everything he had assumed about the silent shapes since the very first hour they had appeared. If they had the ability to reach down from orbit and disable a single weapon system with that kind of precision, without causing a single injury, without even revealing themselves as having done it at all, then whatever their true capability, it was almost certainly far greater than the cautious buildup happening across the surface of the planet could ever hope to match. And if that capability existed, and had been used with such obvious restraint even in the middle of what looked, from their side, like an active attack, then perhaps, Dalton thought, studying the same dark shape still hanging motionless above his city, the intentions behind it were not as simple, or as hostile, as he had spent the last 3 days assuming. It was a small shift, a private, unspoken change in one tired commander's thinking, but it was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of exactly the kind of understanding that both sides of this fragile, dangerous misunderstanding desperately needed, and had so far been entirely unable to reach. The observation, they decided, could not continue indefinitely. A decision would have to be made, and soon, one way or the other. On the 5th morning, Daniel Hurst finally finished the message he and Walter Combe had spent 2 exhausting days constructing, a careful sequence of pulses built entirely from mathematics, patterns any sufficiently advanced mind might recognize as an attempt at communication rather than noise. The problem, as Daniel explained it grimly to Walter over their crackling connection, was no longer building the message. It was finding a way to send it strongly enough, and precisely enough, to actually reach something in orbit hundreds of miles above the surface. His research station's equipment, built for measuring the atmosphere rather than transmitting through it, was simply not powerful enough for the task. He needed access to a stronger transmitter, one built with the range and power to reach orbit, and there was only one place nearby likely to have such equipment: a decommissioned military relay station, several hours away by mountain roads, one that had not been actively used in years but was, according to old records Daniel had found in the station's archive, still technically operational. He gathered his notes, the modified radio, and every scrap of the careful mathematical sequence he and Walter had built, and set out alone in an old station vehicle, driving through winding mountain roads with no working navigation, guided only by paper maps and memory. It was, he knew, a desperate gamble built on an untested theory, but it was the only path forward he could see, and the alternative, waiting quietly while the world edged closer to catastrophe, was no longer something he could bring himself to accept. Meanwhile, in the city where Claire Whitfield and Nathan Price had spent days testing every low-technology method they could think of, a breakthrough of their own finally arrived, though not in the way either of them expected. A retired radio engineer, hearing through word of mouth about their efforts, arrived at their building carrying a battered case of old equipment he had kept in storage for decades, including a transmitter built during an era when radio technology was simpler, sturdier, and crucially, entirely analog. "I heard you were looking for old technology," the engineer said, setting the case down carefully on a nearby table. "This might be older than anything you've already tried." Working through the night, Claire, Nathan, and the retired engineer adapted the old transmitter, boosting its range using components scavenged from other outdated equipment stored in the building's basement. By early morning, they had something that might, if their calculations were correct, be powerful enough to send a clear, simple signal toward the nearest of the silent shapes still hovering above the city. The signal they chose to send was simple by necessity, since building anything as elaborate as Daniel's mathematical sequence would have taken more time than they believed they had left. Instead, they settled on something more direct, a steady, repeating pulse, followed by a pause, followed by the same pulse again, a pattern designed to be unmistakably artificial, unmistakably intentional, impossible to confuse with any natural signal a listening instrument might otherwise ignore. "If nothing else," Claire said quietly, watching Nathan make the final adjustments to the transmitter, "it tells them someone down here is trying. That has to count for something." They activated the signal just as the sun rose fully over the city, sending the simple, repeating pattern outward toward the vessel hanging silently above them, with no way of knowing whether anything up there was listening, or capable of understanding, or even still willing to wait long enough to notice. Aboard that vessel, and every other vessel scattered in careful observation around the planet, the Council of Watchers had reached the edge of its long and difficult debate. The near catastrophe of the previous night, the weapon system prepared for launch and stopped only by a fraction of good fortune and one officer's quick thinking, had convinced a growing number among them that continued observation, without any attempt at direct communication, was no longer a responsible choice. The risk of another mistake, one that might not be caught in time, was growing with every passing hour. "We cannot continue simply watching," argued the same voice that had, from the very beginning, urged patience and understanding toward this fractured, frightened species. "If they cannot speak to us, and cannot speak reliably to each other, then the danger is not merely that they might attack us. The danger is that they might destroy themselves, entirely by accident, while trying only to defend against a threat that exists only in their own fear." Others among the council, particularly those who had grown convinced by the weapon incident that this species could not be trusted with any real understanding of their capabilities, argued instead for withdrawal, a quiet retreat that would end the observation entirely and leave this world to its own uncertain fate, to be reconsidered again, perhaps, at some much later time. It was in the middle of this unresolved debate that the instruments aboard the vessel above Claire and Nathan's city detected something new, a simple, repeating pulse, rising from the surface directly below, artificial, and deliberate in a way that no natural signal could ever be. Moments later, similar detections began arriving from other vessels as well, as Daniel finally arrived at the old relay station and, after nearly an hour of frantic work reconnecting decades-old equipment, managed to send his own carefully constructed mathematical sequence outward into the sky. For the first time since the silence began, the world below was speaking, not through fear, not through weapons, but through simple, deliberate signals sent by ordinary people who had refused to give up on the idea that understanding was still possible. The council's debate stopped almost instantly, replaced by something the observers had not felt since long before this particular study had begun: genuine, cautious hope. Whatever fear and misunderstanding had driven the frightened, fractured response of the days before, these signals, appearing now from multiple points across the surface, suggested something else entirely. They suggested a species still capable, even in its worst and most frightened moments, of reaching outward rather than only defending itself. "They are trying," the patient voice said quietly, relief evident even in its strange, layered pattern of light. "Whatever else has happened, they are still trying to reach us." But even as hope began to spread among the observers, a new and immediate danger was already taking shape on the ground, one that neither Daniel, nor Claire, nor anyone working desperately to build a bridge between two frightened worlds yet knew anything about. In a separate military installation, far from Dalton's careful, restrained command, and far from the quiet diplomatic efforts of people like Isabel Farrow, a different kind of decision was being made. A senior commander named Colonel Peter Ashby, convinced beyond doubt by days of mounting reports, rumors, and one very real near catastrophe the night before, had grown certain that any further delay was nothing but reckless gambling with the lives of everyone under his protection. Unlike Dalton, Ashby did not believe in waiting for clearer signs. He believed the clearest sign had already been given, the moment a weapon system under his own country's control had inexplicably failed at the exact instant it was most needed, an event he was certain could only mean one thing: their enemy above already possessed the ability to strike first, and was simply choosing the moment. Ashby began, quietly, and without informing higher command, until it was already well underway, preparations for a coordinated strike against the nearest of the silent shapes, using every weapon under his direct control that he believed capable of reaching that high. He reasoned, in the exhausted, fear-driven logic of a man who had convinced himself that waiting any longer meant certain disaster, that a first strike, however desperate, was better than continuing to wait for an attack he now believed was inevitable. At Ashby's own installation, not everyone shared his growing certainty. A young logistics officer named Lucy Ainsworth had spent the previous 2 days quietly cataloging every report that came through the base, and something about the pattern troubled her deeply. Every account of aggression from the shapes above, she noticed, seemed to originate from a moment of human action first: an aircraft flying too close, a weapon system being armed, a nervous unit moving without clear orders. Not once, in any report she had gathered, had one of the silent shapes acted first, unprompted, without some human movement immediately before it. She raised this observation carefully with a colleague during a quiet moment between briefings, choosing her words with caution, aware that voicing doubt about the coming strike carried real risk to her own standing on the base. "Every single incident we've logged has us moving first," she said. "I'm not saying that proves anything, but it seems like something worth mentioning before we commit to a strike we can't take back." Her colleague agreed it was worth raising, but neither of them held enough rank to bring the observation directly to Ashby, and the chain of command required to pass such a concern upward moved slowly, weighed down by exhaustion and the same fractured communication plaguing every part of the world. Lucy wrote her observation down carefully instead, on a single sheet of paper, and gave it to a runner heading toward the command building, hoping it might reach someone with the authority to at least ask a single, simple question before it was too late to ask anything at all. Had this world truly been attacked, or had it only ever been watched? Word of Ashby's preparations reached Dalton only by chance, carried by an exhausted messenger who had overheard fragments of the plan from a nervous junior officer, eager to share the burden of what he had learned with someone he trusted. Dalton, upon hearing the report, felt the small, quiet doubt that had been growing within him since the weapon failure 2 nights earlier snap suddenly into full, urgent clarity. He believed, now more than ever, that Ashby's planned strike was based on a catastrophic misunderstanding, one that could destroy in a single reckless moment whatever fragile chance still remained for the kind of understanding Daniel and Claire, in their separate corners of the world, were fighting so desperately to build. But Ashby's installation was hours away. Communication between them remained impossible, and there was no way to send a warning fast enough through any conventional means to stop what was already in motion. Dalton made a decision in that moment that went against every instinct 30 years of careful, measured leadership had taught him. He would go himself, in person, as fast as any vehicle could carry him, in a desperate attempt to reach Ashby before his strike could begin, carrying with him nothing but his own authority, his own hard-won doubt, and a growing, urgent conviction that the world's survival might depend on stopping one frightened, well-meaning commander from making an irreversible mistake. Above the surface, the Council of Observers continued weighing the meaning of the signals they had received, aware even as they debated that time was no longer a resource they could spend as freely as before. The patient voice among them argued that the signals, simple as they were, represented exactly the kind of genuine outreach they had originally hoped this study might eventually produce, and that abandoning the effort now, so close to what might be a real breakthrough, would betray the very purpose of everything they had traveled so far to attempt. A single mathematical sequence and a repeating pulse do not undo the danger we detected 2 nights ago, countered the more cautious voice, though with noticeably less certainty than before. But I will admit, it is difficult to reconcile a species capable of preparing a weapon in fear with one capable of reaching toward us so plainly, using signals built with obvious care, in the very same handful of days. No final decision had yet been reached, but the balance within the council had shifted meaningfully toward patience, enough that the vessel nearest Daniel's relay station began, cautiously, and for the first time since the silence began, preparing a response of its own, a signal built carefully to be recognizable without being alarming, intended to answer the mathematical sequence it had just received in kind. Inside his vehicle, Dalton kept a small folded map spread across his knee, tracing the fastest possible route toward Ashby's installation with one finger, while his driver pushed the engine harder than regulations technically allowed. He thought, as the miles passed, about the strange pulse of light Ellery's pilots had reported days earlier, about the weapon system that had failed in complete and precise silence, and about the small, growing conviction that had been building steadily within him ever since. He did not yet know about Lucy Ainsworth's careful observation, written on a single sheet of paper, and now making its own slow, uncertain journey toward Ashby's command building. He did not know that a version of the very same doubt he carried was already moving, quietly and independently, toward the same destination he was racing to reach. All he knew was that a mistake was about to be made, one built from fear rather than fact, and that he still had a small window of time in which to try to stop it, if only his convoy could outrun the hours already slipping away. As Dalton's convoy sped through empty highways under a sky still holding its silent, patient shapes, and as Daniel Hurst waited anxiously beside his relay station equipment for any sign his signal had been received, and as Claire and Nathan watched their own transmitter continue its steady, repeating pulse toward the vessel above their city, 3 separate threads of the same desperate hope were converging toward a single, uncertain moment, one that would determine, in the space of only a few remaining hours, whether this fragile, frightened world would find its way toward understanding, or lose everything to a mistake that had never needed to happen at all. Colonel Peter Ashby stood in the command building of his installation, staring at a countdown clock built from nothing more than a stopwatch and a chalkboard, marking the minutes remaining until his coordinated strike would begin. Around him, officers moved through final preparations with the tense, focused energy of people who believed, without question, that they were defending their world against an enemy already proven willing to attack. Somewhere in his mind, buried beneath days of exhaustion and fear, a small part of him wondered whether this was truly the right decision. But that small doubt had grown quieter and quieter with each passing hour, drowned out by the louder, more insistent voice of his own certainty. A runner burst into the room, breathless, holding a single sheet of paper that had been passed hand to hand across the base over the last several hours, delayed at every step by exhausted messengers, and a chain of command too fractured to move quickly. Ashby took the paper with visible impatience, glancing at the clock before unfolding it. It was Lucy Ainsworth's observation, the simple, careful note pointing out that every reported incident of aggression from the shapes above had followed, rather than preceded, a human action. Ashby read it once, then again, his jaw tightening. It was not proof of anything, he told himself. It was one junior officer's theory, built from incomplete information, arriving at the worst possible moment to introduce doubt into a plan that had already gone too far to easily reverse. And yet, he found himself reading it a third time, unable to fully dismiss it. Before he could decide what to do with Lucy's note, the door burst open again, and General Henry Dalton strode into the room, dust from the long drive still clinging to his uniform, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had not slept in days but refused to let exhaustion slow him down. "Stand it down," Dalton said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tense murmur of the room. "Right now, whatever you believe you know, I need 5 minutes to tell you what I've learned since the incident 2 nights ago, and I need you to actually listen." Ashby, caught between the countdown clock, Lucy's unsettling note, and the sudden, forceful presence of a senior commander he respected deeply, hesitated only a moment before giving the order to pause the sequence. Officers around the room exchanged uncertain glances, but the countdown stopped, the chalkboard's numbers frozen in place. Dalton laid out everything as quickly and clearly as he could, the strange, precise nature of the weapon failure 2 nights earlier, an act of restraint rather than aggression, he now believed, aimed only at disabling a threat without causing harm. The reports, gathered slowly and painfully from scattered sources across the world, suggesting that every single incident of apparent hostility from the shapes above had followed some human action first, never the reverse. And finally, the small, still unconfirmed rumor that had reached him just before leaving his own command post, of strange, deliberate signals being sent upward from at least 2 separate locations. An attempt, however small, at genuine communication. Ashby listened in tense, uneasy silence, torn between the momentum of days spent convincing himself an attack was inevitable and the growing weight of evidence suggesting he might have been wrong from the very beginning. It was Lucy's note, still held loosely in his hand, that finally tipped the balance. He set it down carefully on the table beside the frozen countdown clock. "Stand everything down," he said quietly, the words costing him more than anyone in the room fully understood. "Full stop. No further preparation until we have something more certain than fear to act on." High above, aboard the vessel nearest Daniel's mountain relay station, the response the Council had cautiously begun preparing was finally complete. A signal built carefully from the same mathematical foundation Daniel had used, answering his sequence with a response of its own, along with something more. Layered within the returning signal was a simple, deliberate pattern representing restored function, a message meant to convey, as clearly as such a message could without shared language, that the silence affecting the world's communication systems was about to end. Daniel, still waiting anxiously beside his equipment, nearly fell out of his chair when the old relay station's receiver crackled to life with a response, faint but unmistakably structured, following the same mathematical logic he and Walter had used to build their own message. He grabbed his radio microphone immediately, calling Walter with a voice cracking from exhaustion and disbelief. "They answered," he said, laughing and nearly crying at the same time, the sound of it half relief and half sheer astonishment. "Walter, they actually answered." Moments later, across the entire planet, every dead screen, every silent phone, every frozen instrument flickered back to life almost simultaneously, the global silence lifting as suddenly and completely as it had first descended 5 days earlier. Radios crackled with static before settling into clear signals. Phones buzzed with days of delayed messages arriving all at once. Satellite feeds resumed, showing, among countless other things, the true scale and number of the shapes that had been hovering quietly above the world the entire time, now visible with perfect clarity to instruments that had been blind to them for days. Claire Whitfield, standing beside Nathan Price and their small, exhausted team, watched the wall of monitors above her desk flicker from gray to a wash of live, functioning data, and felt a wave of relief so strong her knees nearly buckled. Around the room, exhausted analysts who had spent 5 days improvising with old technology and desperate hope broke into a mixture of stunned silence and quiet, disbelieving laughter, the sound of people who had genuinely not been certain this moment would ever come. Then, layered within the restored global communication systems, A message began appearing simultaneously across every reconnected channel on the planet, broadcast not in any single human language, but translated almost instantly by the very systems it traveled through, as though the intelligence behind it had studied human language carefully enough, during its days of silent observation, to now speak in words every person on Earth could understand. The message was simple, and it did not attempt to excuse or minimize what had happened. It explained, plainly, that the silence had never been intended as an act of aggression, but as a careful, if flawed, method of observing a young civilization without the distortion of self-conscious performance. A method that had, in this case, caused a level of fear and misunderstanding far beyond anything ever intended. It acknowledged the mistake in that method directly, without excuse, and expressed something that felt, even translated through unfamiliar systems into human words, remarkably close to genuine regret. It also acknowledged something else, something that struck many who read it with a quiet, uncomfortable sense of recognition. In the vacuum left by that silence, faced with confusion and an unexplained presence in the sky, this civilization's near-universal first instinct had been to prepare for war. Every nation, largely in isolation from every other, had reached for the same fearful conclusion, and had come, in the end, within a hair's breadth of the very outcome that both sides had most wanted to avoid. But the message did not end there. It went on to describe the small, scattered signals that had reached the observing vessels in the final hours before contact was restored, the mathematical sequence built by a physicist working alone with an old radio, the steady, repeating pulse sent by a small team using decades-old equipment salvaged from a basement, and other similar efforts detected at scattered points around the globe, each one representing ordinary people who had refused to let fear be the only answer their world offered. It was those signals, the message explained honestly, that had ultimately convinced the Council of Observers that this civilization, whatever its flaws, whatever its fear, remained capable of genuine outreach, even in its most difficult moment, and deserved the chance to continue this contact, rather than have it end in silence and withdrawal. Isabel Farrow, the young diplomat, who had spent an afternoon drafting a handwritten call for restraint with 2 colleagues from neighboring countries, learned only later how far their small, informal statement had actually traveled. Copied by hand and carried by exhausted messengers through the final tense days of the crisis, it had reached several regional command posts, including, remarkably, the very base where Colonel Ashby had nearly launched his strike. A junior officer there, having read the statement earlier that same day, later admitted it was part of what had made him willing to carry Lucy Ainsworth's note forward as quickly as he had, rather than setting it aside amid the noise of final preparations. Isabel, hearing this months afterward during a formal review of the crisis, felt a quiet, humbling sense of how small, ordinary efforts had woven together in ways none of the people involved could have predicted at the time. Marcus Ellery, the officer whose 2 fighter jets had first reported the alarming pulse of light from the nearest vessel, spent a long time afterward reflecting on how easily that single, misread moment had rippled outward into fear affecting places far beyond his own base. When the full explanation of the visitor's observation method was released publicly, including a detailed account of how ordinary sensor activity had so often been mistaken for aggression throughout those 5 days, Ellery found himself thinking often about his 2 pilots, both of whom had acted exactly as their training demanded, and neither of whom had done anything wrong. The mistake, he came to understand, had not belonged to any single person. It had belonged to an entire situation built from silence, fear, and the impossible difficulty of interpreting the unfamiliar correctly on the very first try. He requested, some weeks later, to be included in the small group of military officers now working directly with civilian scientists on a permanent framework for recognizing the difference between observation and threat, a slow, careful process built specifically so that no future misunderstanding could unfold as quickly, or as dangerously, as this one nearly had. In the weeks that followed, the world grappled slowly and unevenly with everything that had happened. Some leaders, humbled by how close their own frightened decisions had come to catastrophe, began quiet conversations with their neighbors about better ways to coordinate during any future crisis. Conversations that, ironically, might never have happened without the very isolation that had nearly caused disaster in the first place. Others remained deeply suspicious of the visitor's explanation, unwilling to fully trust a species, or whatever the observers truly were, that had caused so much fear, however unintentionally, and pointed to the near catastrophe at Ashby's base as proof that trust remained dangerously premature. General Dalton, called before a gathering of senior officials to give an account of the events at Ashby's installation, spoke plainly about the mistake that had nearly been made and about the small, persistent doubt that had ultimately led him to act before it was too late. He made a point, in that account, of naming Lucy Ainsworth directly, insisting that her careful, quiet observation, easy to overlook amid the noise and fear of those final desperate hours, deserved as much credit for preventing catastrophe as anything he himself had done. Lucy, listening from the back of the room, found herself unexpectedly reassigned in the weeks that followed to a newly formed office, tasked with studying exactly the kind of pattern she had noticed almost by accident, a small, quiet acknowledgement that careful attention, even from the most junior voices, had mattered enormously when it counted most. Daniel Hurst and Walter Combe, the physicist and the retired engineer who had never met in person, finally did meet several weeks later, at a small gathering organized to honor the scattered individuals whose independent efforts had helped restore contact. Standing together for the first time, having spent 5 of the most intense days of their lives connected only by a crackling radio signal, they found they had little to say to each other beyond simple, quiet gratitude, the kind that needed no elaborate words to be understood. Claire Whitfield and Nathan Price returned, eventually, to something resembling their old work, though neither of them ever looked at the old, low-technology equipment stored in their building's basement quite the same way again. Claire kept, on her desk, a small piece of the modified transmitter they had used during those 5 days, a quiet reminder that even in a world built entirely around advanced technology, the oldest and simplest tools sometimes mattered more than anyone expected. Olivia Marsh continued her work at the hospital, though she found herself thinking often about the quiet crowd she had stood among during those uncertain days, and about how much of the world's fate, in the end, had rested not only on generals and physicists, but on countless small, ordinary choices made by people who had no idea how much their patience, or their fear, might ultimately matter. Grace Sutton, the air traffic controller who had watched her radar screen freeze on that very first morning, returned to work once systems came back online, to find the airport in a state of careful, methodical recovery, aircraft slowly returning to the skies, as instruments and schedules were checked and rechecked before anything resumed at full pace. She found herself, in quiet moments between shifts, thinking often about the strange stillness of those 5 days, how completely the sky had seemed to hold its breath, and how strange it now felt to watch it fill again, with ordinary flights heading to ordinary places, ferrying people who, for the most part, would never fully grasp how close their world had come to a very different outcome. She kept, taped to the edge of her workstation, a small printed copy of the message that had appeared across the world's restored communication systems, the one explaining the visitors' intentions and their regret. It was not there as a decoration. It was there as a reminder, one she found herself glancing at more often than she expected during the long, quiet hours of her shifts, that even the most advanced and careful plans, whether built by generals or by beings capable of silencing an entire planet, could still go wrong in ways nobody fully anticipated, and that recovering from such mistakes required patience from everyone involved, not just an apology from one side. The formal review that followed, gathering testimony from dozens of people across many countries who had each played some small part in the final hours before contact was restored, produced a report far longer and more complicated than anyone had expected, filled with near misses, quiet acts of courage, and mistakes that, in hindsight, seemed almost inevitable, given how completely the world had been cut off from itself. Historians studying the crisis in the years that followed would often note the same striking pattern, that the outcome had never truly rested on any single decision, any single leader, or any single moment, but on a fragile, interconnected web of choices made by ordinary people, most of whom never knew, at the time, how much their small part mattered. As for the visitors themselves, contact continued in the months that followed, slow and careful on both sides, built now on something closer to honest communication than either silence or assumption. It was not always easy. Old fears did not disappear overnight, and the memory of how close the world had come to catastrophe lingered uncomfortably in the background of every new conversation. But it was, for the first time since the silence first fell 5 days earlier, a conversation built on words rather than fear, and on listening rather than assumption, and for a world that had so nearly destroyed its first chance at understanding, before it had even properly begun, that quiet, careful progress felt, to nearly everyone involved, like nothing short of a second chance neither side had fully expected to receive.